They dismissed it as theatrical. They scoffed at it as a weapon for show, something to frighten children, not warriors. But when the first stream of liquid fire arced across Tarawa's coral sand, stretching impossibly far, turning reinforced concrete into crematoriums, Japanese commanders stopped laughing. How did a tool once mocked as primitive become the instrument that burned through an empire's most impenetrable defenses? And why did the sound of igniting fuel haunt survivors for decades after the war ended? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon over Bidio Island when Lieutenant Colonel Takeshi Hironaka stood atop his command bunker, gazing across the fortifications that had taken 18 months to construct. November 1943. The coral atoll of Tarawa stretched before him like a fortress risen from the sea itself. Concrete pillboxes 3 feet thick. Steel-reinforced bunkers buried beneath tons of sand and palm logs. Interlocking fields of fire that covered every inch of beach. Machine gun nests positioned so that no invader could advance more than 10 yards without entering a kill zone. This was not merely a defensive position. This was a statement carved in coral and concrete. The Americans would bleed here. They would drown in their own hubris. Hironaka had read the intelligence reports with something close to amusement. The Americans were bringing flamethrowers. Primitive devices that spat burning liquid perhaps 20 or 30 feet if the wind cooperated. He had seen photographs of the early models, bulky contraptions that made their operators targets, walking slowly with tanks strapped to their backs like pack animals. In China, such weapons had proven more dangerous to their users than to entrenched defenders. A single rifle shot to the fuel tank and the operator became a pillar of fire. The Imperial Navy had even tested similar devices and concluded they were impractical for serious warfare. Too short range. Too vulnerable. Too dependent on weather conditions that could shift in seconds. The other officers shared his confidence. During morning briefings, they would joke about the American fondness for gadgets and machinery. Captain Shinji Morita, commander of the Southern Defensive Sector, had laughed openly when discussing the flamethrowers. "They will try to scare us with fire," he said, sipping tea in the cool darkness of the command bunker. "As if we are children afraid of shadows. Let them come with their toys. Our bunkers were built to withstand naval bombardment. What will their little torches do against 3 feet of reinforced concrete?" The other officers nodded in agreement. They had studied American tactics. The enemy relied too heavily on technology, on machines to do what warrior spirit should accomplish. When their machines failed, when their gadgets proved useless against Japanese determination, the Americans would break. What none of them knew, what no intelligence report had revealed, was that the weapon coming ashore at Tarawa was not the clumsy device they imagined. The M2 flamethrower represented a complete reimagining of fire as a weapon of war. Where the old M1 model had struggled to project flame 40 feet, the M2 could unleash streams of thickened fuel that reached 150 feet with devastating accuracy. The fuel itself had been transformed. Gone was the simple gasoline that evaporated quickly and burned out in seconds. In its place was a new substance, a jellied petroleum mixture that clung to whatever it touched, burning at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees, hot enough to melt steel, to turn concrete into crumbling slag, to consume oxygen so rapidly that men suffocated before the flames ever reached them. The Americans had learned brutal lessons in the Solomon Islands, at Guadalcanal and New Georgia, where Japanese bunkers had held out for days against conventional attacks. They had watched young men die by the hundreds trying to silence machine gun nests that refused to yield. They had seen grenades bounce off reinforced positions, watched rifle fire chip uselessly at concrete walls. The flamethrower had emerged not from some laboratory experiment but from desperate necessity. When Lieutenant Richard Tregiscus first witnessed the weapon in action during trials in Hawaii, he wrote in his journal that it was like watching the sun fall to earth. The flame did not flicker or dance. It roared. It lived. And everything it touched ceased to exist. The engineering behind the M2 was deceptively simple yet devastatingly effective. Two cylindrical tanks, one containing fuel, the other compressed nitrogen to provide propulsion. A flexible hose connected to a wand with an ignition system that used a small pilot light, similar to a welding torch. But the true innovation lay in the fuel mixture and the pressure system. By thickening the fuel with a substance the soldiers called napalm, a portmanteau of naphthenic and palmitic acids, engineers created a liquid that stuck to surfaces like glue and burned with an intensity that defied imagination. The nitrogen propulsion system generated enough force to shoot this burning gel in a cohesive stream that maintained its shape across incredible distances. A trained operator could place fire with the precision of a rifle shot. Before Tarawa, the weapon had been tested extensively, but always against mock targets, practice bunkers built to approximate enemy fortifications. The men who trained with the M2 understood its power in abstract terms. They knew the specifications, the range, the fuel capacity, the burn time. They had watched demonstrations where flames engulfed wooden structures and melted metal drums. But understanding a weapon's capability and experiencing its effect in actual combat were vastly different things. The flamethrower operators, young men mostly, many barely 20 years old, carried a burden unlike any other soldier. They walked into battle wearing 70 pounds of fuel and compressed gas, knowing that a single bullet in the wrong place would transform them instantly into human torches. The survival rate for flamethrower operators in the Pacific was among the lowest of any military specialty. Private First Class Daniel Kovacs from Pittsburgh had been selected for flamethrower training because of his size and strength. At 6'3" and 220 pounds, he could carry the weapon's weight without being slowed significantly. But size meant nothing compared to the psychological weight of what he would be asked to do. During training at Camp Pendleton, instructors had been brutally honest about the weapon's nature. This was not a tool for killing at a distance. This was intimate warfare. The operator would see the faces of the men he burned. He would hear their screams. He would smell burning flesh for hours after each engagement. The instructors offered anyone who wanted out a chance to return to regular infantry with no questions asked, no judgment. 3 men out of every training company accepted that offer. Kovacs stayed. Not because he wanted to, but because someone had to, and walking away felt like abandoning the men who would go forward regardless. The doctrine surrounding flamethrower use had evolved rapidly through trial and error. Early attempts to use the weapons in frontal assaults had resulted in catastrophic casualties. The operators were too exposed, too slow, too visible. Target the fuel tanks, and the resulting explosions served as terrible warnings. By mid-1943, Marine commanders had developed new tactics. Flamethrower teams would advance under covering fire, using terrain and smoke for concealment. They would work in coordination with demolition experts and riflemen, creating combined arms teams specifically designed to crack hardened positions. The flamethrower was never meant to be used alone. It was the final element in a carefully orchestrated sequence of violence. But doctrine and reality diverged the moment boots hit contested ground. No plan survived contact with an enemy who fought with fanatical determination from positions engineered to maximize defensive advantage. The Japanese had spent nearly 2 years fortifying Tarawa, and the result was a defensive network unlike anything the Marines had previously encountered. Every bunker was positioned to support every other bunker. Retreat was impossible because there was nowhere to retreat to on an island barely 2 miles long and 800 yards wide. The defenders numbered nearly 5,000 men, all of whom had been told that surrender was not an option, that death in defense of the emperor was the highest honor, that taking as many Americans as possible into that death was their sacred duty. 3 days before the invasion, Admiral Keiji Shibasaki, overall commander of Tarawa's defenses, gathered his officers for a final briefing. The mood was somber but confident. Shibasaki was a veteran of China and the early Pacific campaigns, a man who had seen war at its most brutal and emerged with his faith in Japanese superiority intact. He spread maps across the table in the headquarters bunker, deep beneath sand and coral, a space that felt more like a tomb than a command center. "The Americans will come with their overwhelming numbers," he said, tracing the likely landing zones with his finger. "They will bombard us from the sea and air. They will believe their machines have broken our will. But they will learn, as others have learned, that Japanese soldiers. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Do not break. We will let them land. We will let them think they are winning. And then, when they are exposed on the reef and the beaches, we will destroy them. The admiral's confidence was not without foundation. Every calculation suggested that the American assault would cost thousands of lives. The reef surrounding Bidio would force landing craft to stop hundreds of yards from shore, meaning Marines would have to wade through chest-deep water under fire. The preliminary bombardment, no matter how intensive, could not destroy bunkers buried beneath multiple layers of protection. And once ashore, the attackers would find no cover, no concealment, only open killing grounds swept by machine guns positioned with mathematical precision. Japanese planners estimated that even if the Americans eventually took the island, the cost would be so severe that it would delay their advance across the Pacific by months, perhaps long enough for Japan to consolidate defenses elsewhere or negotiate a favorable peace. What the Japanese planners had not accounted for, what they could not have predicted, was the psychological impact of a weapon that transformed their greatest strength into a death trap. The bunkers that made them feel invincible would become ovens. The concrete walls that stopped bullets and shells would trap them with flames that sucked away oxygen and cooked flesh inside armor that offered no escape. The interconnected defensive positions that allowed mutual support would become channels through which fire flowed like water, spreading from bunker to bunker until entire sections of the defensive line burned simultaneously. On the transport ships waiting offshore, Marines made their final preparations in the hours before dawn. Veterans helped newer men check equipment, tighten straps, go through rituals that kept fear at bay. Kovacs and the other flamethrower operators underwent additional inspections. The fuel tanks had to be perfectly sealed. The hoses could show no signs of wear or damage. The ignition system had to function flawlessly because there would be no second chances once they hit the beach. Sergeant Marcus Bellamy, a flamethrower operator who had survived Guadalcanal, moved among the newer men offering quiet advice. "The manual says 150 feet, he told them. "That's under perfect conditions. Figure on about 100 feet in combat. Wind matters. Aim low. The fuel stream arcs. You want it hitting at ground level and flowing into the opening, not splashing against the wall above. And for God's sake, watch for grenades. If they throw one near you, forget the target and get distance. The explosion won't kill you, but if it ruptures your tanks while there's fire nearby, you won't have time to scream." The transport ship's hold smelled of oil, sweat, and the unique scent of fear that no amount of training could eliminate. Men wrote letters they hoped would never be sent. They checked photographs of wives and girlfriends, children they had left behind, parents who waited for news. Some prayed. Others sat in silence, staring at nothing, preparing their minds for what was coming. The flamethrower operators sat together, a small fraternity bound by shared understanding of the terrible burden they carried. They did not speak much. There was nothing to say that had not already been said during training, during the long voyage across the Pacific, during the countless hours of waiting that characterized military life. As the sky began to lighten, the naval bombardment commenced. 14-inch guns from battleships pounded Bidio with shells weighing as much as small cars. Cruisers and destroyers added their firepower, walking explosions across every square yard of the island. Dive bombers screamed down through clouds of smoke and coral dust, dropping 500-pound bombs on targets marked by pre-invasion reconnaissance. The noise was beyond description, a physical force that made thought impossible. For 3 hours, the bombardment continued without pause. Observers on the command ships watched through binoculars as the islands seemed to disintegrate under the onslaught. Palm trees vanished. Structures collapsed. Entire sections of the defensive perimeter disappeared under avalanches of coral and sand. Deep in his bunker, Admiral Shibasaki felt each impact as a distant tremor. Dust fell from the ceiling with each heavy shell strike. The bunker's construction was being tested, layers of coconut logs, coral sand, and reinforced concrete absorbing punishment that would have obliterated lesser fortifications. Around him, staff officers monitored reports from observation posts, tracking the bombardment's progression. Casualties were surprisingly light. Most of the defenders had taken shelter in the deepest bunkers, exactly as planned. The Americans were expending enormous amounts of ammunition to accomplish very little. When the bombardment lifted, when the Marines began their approach, the defenders would emerge and demonstrate that concrete and determination could withstand anything the Americans threw at them. At 0 hour, landing craft loaded with Marines began their approach. The plan called for a precisely timed assault, waves of landing craft hitting the beach in coordinated succession, overwhelming the defenders through sheer momentum and numerical superiority. But the plan began falling apart almost immediately. The reef, which reconnaissance had suggested would be covered by high tide, remained exposed. Landing craft grounded hundreds of yards from shore. Marines poured out and began wading through chest-deep water, struggling against the current, weighed down by equipment, presenting perfect targets. The Japanese defenders emerged from their bunkers and opened fire. Machine guns swept the water in methodical patterns. Artillery and mortars adjusted fire based on spotters calling corrections. The ocean churned with impacts. Marines fell, disappeared beneath the surface, struggled forward through comrades' bodies floating in water that turned red. The carefully planned waves of assault craft became clusters of desperate men trying to reach any cover, any protection from fire that came from every direction. Some landing craft, attempting to bypass the reef by approaching from different angles, ran onto underwater obstacles and mines, exploding in gouts of flame and debris. Kovacs hit the water from a landing craft that had managed to get slightly closer than most, perhaps 200 yards from shore instead of 400. The water came to his chest, and the weight of the flamethrower tried to drag him under. He locked his knees and pushed forward, following the Marine ahead of him, trying not to think about what the fuel tanks on his back represented to enemy gunners. Machine gun fire snapped past so close he felt the displacement of air. A Marine 3 feet to his left simply fell forward and did not rise. Another to his right took a round through the throat and grabbed at the wound uselessly before collapsing. Kovacs kept moving because stopping meant dying. The beach was the only objective that mattered. Reach the beach and there might be cover. Stay in the water and death was certain. It took 20 minutes to cross 200 yards of water. When Kovacs finally staggered onto the beach, he threw himself behind a low seawall made of palm logs and coral, the only cover available. Around him, Marines clustered in groups, pinned down, unable to advance against fire coming from bunkers that seemed to be everywhere. He could see the nearest pillbox, perhaps 50 yards inland, concrete walls pocked by the morning's bombardment but clearly intact, the dark slit of a firing port from which muzzle flashes flickered continuously. A Marine near him tried to move toward it and was cut down before he made 3 steps. Another tried and died the same way. The machine gun commanding this section of beach had perfect fields of fire, and as long as it remained operational, no advance was possible. Lieutenant James Chen, the officer commanding Kovacs's section, scrambled along the seawall, keeping his head below the lip, assessing the situation. He had expected casualties, had prepared himself for losses, but the reality exceeded even the worst-case scenarios discussed during planning. Half his platoon was gone, dead in the water or wounded and unable to advance. The beach was a killing ground with no room to maneuver. Conventional tactics were useless. Charging the bunkers was suicide. Staying pinned meant dying slowly as Japanese mortars found their range. The only option was to use the weapons specifically designed for this situation, regardless of the risk. Chen found Kovacs and another flamethrower operator, a kid from Texas named Roy Walsh. "See that bunker?" Chen pointed toward the nearest pillbox. "We need it gone. I'll organize covering fire. When I give the signal, you two move together. Alternate. One fires while the other advances. Don't stop. Don't think. Just move and burn." Walsh looked at Kovacs with eyes that said everything and nothing. They both knew the odds. Flamethrower operators advancing across open ground against a bunker specifically designed to kill anything that approached. But someone had to do it, and they were the ones carrying the weapons. Chen gathered every Marine within shouting distance who still had ammunition. When I say go, pour fire into that bunker. Not aim shots. Volume. Make them keep their heads down. He checked his watch, synchronized with Walsh and Kovacs, counted down from 10. At 0, 20 Marines opened fire simultaneously. The bunker's firing slit disappeared behind impacts, rounds chipping concrete, forcing the defenders to pull back from their weapon momentarily. Kovacs rose and ran. Not toward the bunker directly, but at an angle, using what little terrain variation existed, staying low, the flamethrowers' weight forgotten in the surge of adrenaline. He made 20 yards before the covering fire slackened and he dove behind a crater left by the morning's bombardment. Walsh was up and moving before Kovacs even stopped rolling. The kid from Texas made it 30 yards, found cover behind the shattered remains of a palm tree. Now they were close enough. Kovacs could see the bunker's details clearly. The firing slit perhaps 8 inches high, 3 feet wide. The concrete walls sloped slightly, designed to deflect shells. But he could also see the ventilation ports, small openings near the roof meant to prevent carbon monoxide buildup from the machine guns firing. He signaled Walsh. Together. The covering fire intensified again. Kovacs and Walsh rose simultaneously and advanced the final distance. 40 yards. 30. 20. The machine gun swung toward them, muzzle flashes visible even in daylight. Rounds kicked up sand at Kovacs's feet. Something tugged at his sleeve. And then he was close enough. He raised the wand, aimed for the firing slit, and squeezed the trigger. What happened next would be described in after-action reports with clinical precision. Approximately 30 gallons of thickened fuel projected across 90 feet in a coherent stream lasting 3 seconds. The flame, burning at 2,100 degrees Fahrenheit, entered the bunker through the firing slit and expanded to fill the interior space. Occupants died from a combination of direct burns, oxygen deprivation, and toxic gas inhalation. Structural damage to the fortification included melted firing mechanisms, warped support beams, and compromised integrity of the concrete due to extreme thermal stress. But what the reports could not capture, what no words could adequately convey, was the reality of what Kovacs witnessed. The stream of fire that leapt from his weapon was not flame as understood by anyone who had only seen normal fire. It was liquid sun. It arced across the distance with impossible grace, a perfect ribbon of light and heat that maintained its shape as if the laws of physics had been suspended. When it struck the bunker's firing slit, it did not splash or scatter. It poured inside like water flowing through a pipe, except this water burned with intensity that transformed everything it touched. The machine gun fire stopped instantly. From inside the bunker came sounds that Kovacs would hear in nightmares for the rest of his life. Screaming that rose and fell in pitch like sirens. The crack and pop of ammunition cooking off in the heat. A deeper roaring sound as the fire consumed everything combustible, feeding on itself, growing stronger. Then the screaming stopped. Smoke poured from every opening in the bunker, black and oily, carrying smells that made Kovacs turn and vomit even as Walsh fired his own weapon at a second bunker 30 yards beyond the first. Feet, catching the second bunker's defenders as they tried to react to the first bunker's destruction. The jellied fuel splashed against the concrete and flowed through the firing slit like honey, like something alive and malevolent, seeking every gap and opening. Within seconds, that bunker too was belching smoke and flame. The defenders tried to escape through the rear exit, and Kovacs watched men emerge on fire from head to foot, living torches that ran 3 or 4 steps before collapsing. One made it perhaps 10 feet before a mercy shot from a Marine rifleman ended his agony. Lieutenant Chen stared at the 2 bunkers, both now completely silent, smoke still rising from their interiors. He had read the reports from training, had seen demonstrations, had been briefed on the M2s' capabilities. But seeing it employed in combat was fundamentally different. The weapon had not simply killed the bunker's occupants. It had erased them. Made them cease to exist in any meaningful sense. And it had done so in seconds, covering distances that should have been impossible for a man-portable flame weapon. Along the seawall, Marines who had witnessed the attack began to move forward cautiously. The section of beach that had been a death trap moments earlier was suddenly open. The machine guns that had pinned down hundreds of men were silent. And the Marines advancing past the smoking bunkers looked at Kovacs and Walsh with expressions that mixed gratitude with something approaching horror. What they had just witnessed was not war as they understood it. It was something older, more primal. It was the power of fire wielded with modern precision, and it was absolutely terrifying. In his command bunker deep underground, Admiral Shibasaki received reports of the breakthrough. The language was urgent but confused. Defenders spoke of impossible flames, fire that reached across distances that should have been safe, bunkers that had withstood bombardments suddenly going silent within seconds. Initially, Shibasaki dismissed these reports as panic, the natural exaggeration that came from men under stress seeing weapons for the first time. But as more reports arrived from different sectors, all describing the same phenomenon, he began to understand that something had changed. The Americans had brought something new to BDO. Something his planners had not anticipated. He gathered his staff and demanded information about American flamethrowers. The intelligence files were thin. Old photographs. Estimates of range and capability based on captured equipment from earlier campaigns. Nothing suggesting the weapon could project fire the distances being reported. Colonel Hironaka, who that morning had laughed about American gadgets, studied the incoming reports with growing unease. Bunkers that were supposed to hold for days were falling in minutes. Positions that should have required artillery or aerial bombardment to crack were being silenced by individual soldiers carrying what appeared to be portable flame projectors of unprecedented power. "We must adapt our tactics," Hironaka said, trying to maintain the confidence that had characterized his earlier assessments. "Tell the defenders to engage these flame operators from maximum distance. Target them before they can get close enough to employ their weapons. And seal the firing slits on bunkers not actively engaging. Limit the openings through which the flame can enter." But implementation of new tactics in the midst of battle, with communications degraded by the ongoing bombardment and assault, proved nearly impossible. Marines were already pushing inland from multiple beachheads, and everywhere they encountered bunkers, flamethrower teams were being brought forward. The pattern repeated across BDO throughout the afternoon. Bunkers that had been invisible during the naval bombardment, their camouflage perfect, their fields of fire interlocking, began revealing themselves as they engaged the advancing Americans. And as soon as they revealed themselves, they became targets for weapons that killed with prehistoric brutality enhanced by modern engineering. Private Walsh and Kovacs moved inland as part of the general advance, no longer operating independently but as integral parts of a combined arms team. Riflemen would identify bunker positions. Demolition experts would attempt to close secondary exits. And then the flamethrower operators would advance under covering fire and burn. The tactic worked with brutal efficiency. By late afternoon, the two of them had silenced 8 bunkers between them. 8 positions that would have taken hours to reduce through conventional means, that would have cost dozens of Marine lives each, eliminated in seconds by flame that reached impossibly far and burned impossibly hot. The cost to the operators was measured in more than physical exhaustion, though that was severe enough. Each time Kovacs employed the weapon, he experienced the attack with all his senses. He saw the flame arc across distance, beautiful and terrible. He heard the screams, sometimes lasting seconds, sometimes longer if the defenders tried to flee through areas still burning. He smelled burning fuel mixed with burning flesh, an odor that clung to his uniform, his hair, his skin, that made eating impossible because every smell triggered memories he desperately wanted to suppress. And he felt the heat, not just from his own weapon but from the bunkers after they had been hit, concrete radiating thermal energy so intense it could be felt 30 feet away. By nightfall, the Marines had established a tenuous foothold on BDO, but at staggering cost. Nearly 1,500 casualties in the first day. Bodies floating in the lagoon. Wounded men crying for help from positions still under fire. But they had advanced farther than planners had thought possible, had broken through defensive lines that should have held for days. And the weapon that had made the difference, that had cracked positions designed to withstand conventional assault, was being discussed in whispered conversations among survivors who had witnessed its effects. In the Japanese command bunker, the mood had shifted from confidence to grim determination. The Americans had gotten ashore in force, something that was not supposed to happen. Their flame weapons had proven far more effective than anyone had predicted. But the battle was far from over. Thousands of defenders remained, occupying hundreds of fortified positions. The Americans would have to pay for every yard with blood. And perhaps, once they understood the true cost of taking BDO, they would reconsider their advance across the Pacific. Perhaps the sacrifice of this garrison would buy time for Japan to prepare defenses elsewhere, to develop countermeasures against these terrible flame weapons, to show that even with their machines and gadgets, the Americans could be made to bleed enough that victory became too expensive to pursue. Admiral Shibasaki called his officers together one final time as darkness settled over the island. "Tomorrow they will come again," he said. "They will bring their flames and their bombs and their overwhelming numbers. We cannot stop them forever. But we can make them remember BDO for the rest of their lives. We can show them that Japanese soldiers do not surrender, do not retreat, do not compromise. Every man who dies here dies in service to the Emperor. And every American who survives will carry the memory of this place as a wound that never heals." The officers bowed and returned to their posts. Outside, the night was filled with sounds of digging, Marines establishing positions, bringing supplies forward, preparing for the next day's assault. Occasionally, small arms fire crackled as nervous sentries shot at shadows. Flares drifted down on parachutes, casting the torn landscape in harsh white light. And in the smoking ruins of bunkers already taken, fires still burned, smaller now but persistent, fuel that refused to be extinguished continuing to smolder through the night. Kovacs sat with his back against a shell crater's wall, the flamethrower beside him, and tried to eat rations he could not taste. Walsh was 20 feet away, staring at nothing. Neither spoke. Around them, other Marines prepared for the possibility of a nighttime counterattack, checking ammunition, positioning grenades within easy reach, trying to stay alert despite exhaustion that made thought difficult. Lieutenant Chin moved among them, offering quiet words of encouragement, checking on wounded men, maintaining the illusion that he had everything under control when in reality he was as shaken as anyone by what the day had revealed. Tomorrow would bring more of the same. More bunkers to burn. More screaming from inside fortifications that became ovens. More smoke and smell and sounds that would never fade from memory. But tonight, for these few hours, there was only waiting and remembering and trying not to think too hard about what morning would bring. The M2 flamethrower sat silent beside Kovacs, its fuel tanks partially depleted, its one still warm from the day's work. In the darkness, it looked almost innocent, like camping equipment, like something you might use to clear brush or start a campfire. But Kovacs knew better. He had seen what it could do. He had wielded that terrible power. And he understood with absolute certainty that this weapon had changed something fundamental about the war they were fighting. The Japanese had laughed at American flamethrowers, had dismissed them as theatrical toys. Tomorrow, and in all the days that followed, no one would be laughing. Dawn arrived over BDO with the kind of beauty that seemed obscene given what had happened the previous day and what was about to unfold. The sky turned from deep purple to rose gold, and for perhaps 30 seconds, the island looked almost peaceful. Then the naval bombardment resumed, shattering the illusion with salvos that walked across the interior of the atoll, seeking bunkers that had survived the first day's assault. Kovacs woke from a sleep that had been more unconsciousness than rest, his body aching from the flamethrower's weight and the previous day's violence. Around him, Marines were already stirring, checking weapons, redistributing ammunition from the dead to the living, preparing for the continuation of a battle that had only paused, never stopped. Lieutenant Chin gathered the survivors of his platoon, now reduced to perhaps 60% of its original strength. His face showed the strain of command, the weight of decisions that had sent men to their deaths and would send more today. He spread a map across the coral sand, marking positions that intelligence had identified overnight. The Japanese defensive network was even more extensive than initial estimates suggested. Layers upon layers of fortifications, some connected by tunnels, others standing alone but positioned to support each other through overlapping fields of fire. The admiral commanding the defense had built not just a fortress but an interconnected system where the destruction of one position barely weakened the whole. "We advance inland today," Chen said, his finger tracing the route on the map. "Our objective is this airfield." He tapped a point in the island's center. "Command believes if we take it, we cut their defensive network in half. But between here and there are at least 20 major bunkers, probably more we haven't identified yet. The Flame teams did outstanding work yesterday. Today we need more of the same, except harder and faster." His eyes found Kovacs and Walsh. "You two okay to continue?" Walsh nodded without speaking. Kovacs managed a verbal affirmative that sounded more confident than he felt. The truth was neither of them was okay, not in any meaningful sense. They had crossed a threshold the previous day, had done things that changed them in ways they were only beginning to understand. But the mission required their skills, and there were men depending on them, so personal discomfort became irrelevant. They would carry the flamethrowers forward because that was what the Corps needed, and in the calculus of amphibious warfare, individual feelings mattered less than tactical necessity. The assault resumed at 0700 hours. This time, the Marines advanced from established positions rather than wading through killing zones, but the Japanese defenders had used the night to adjust their tactics as well. As Chen's platoon moved inland, they encountered new obstacles. Wires strung at ankle height to trip attackers. Mines buried just beneath the sand's surface. And most significantly, Japanese soldiers who had emerged from their bunkers and taken positions in shell craters and behind debris, creating an outer defensive screen designed to kill flamethrower operators before they could approach the hardened fortifications. The first indication of the changed tactics came when a sniper's bullet struck a flamethrower operator from 3rd Platoon perhaps 50 yards to Kovacs's left. The round hit the fuel tank with devastating results. The operator disappeared in a fireball that rose 30 feet into the air, the explosion sending flaming fuel in every direction. Marines nearby were splashed with burning gel, and their screams added to the chaos as they rolled in the sand trying to extinguish flames that stuck to skin and uniform with terrible persistence. The message was clear. The Japanese had identified the flamethrowers as critical threats and were prioritizing their destruction. Chen adapted quickly, altering the advance pattern. Instead of moving the flame teams forward aggressively, he had them hang back while riflemen cleared suspected sniper positions. It slowed the advance but reduced exposure. Kovacs and Walsh moved in short rushes, never staying exposed for more than a few seconds, always seeking the next piece of cover. The weight of the flamethrower, which had felt manageable the previous day in the surge of adrenaline, now seemed crushing. Every step required conscious effort. Every movement had to be calculated to avoid presenting a clear silhouette to hidden shooters. They reached their first objective around mid-morning, a large bunker complex that appeared to house a command post based on the antenna arrays visible above the sand. The structure was massive, easily twice the size of the positions they had encountered the previous day. Multiple firing ports covered every approach. Intelligence suggested it might be connected to underground tunnels, meaning even if they neutralized the visible positions, defenders could retreat and reappear elsewhere. This would require coordination beyond what 2 flame teams could provide. Chen called forward a demolition team led by Sergeant Frank Delgado, a combat engineer who had somehow survived BOT. In Tarawa's first day, Delgado studied the bunker through binoculars, noting angles and vulnerabilities. "That's a tough nut," he said finally. 3 feet of concrete minimum, probably reinforced. The firing ports are too small for satchel charges. We'd need to get explosives through the doorway, and that means getting close enough to touch it. He turned to Kovacs. "How much fuel you got left?" Kovacs checked his gauge. "Maybe 2/3. Enough for 3, maybe 4 sustained bursts." "That'll work," Delgado said, formulating a plan even as he spoke. "Here's what we do. Smoke the approaches, heavy concentration. Under that cover, we advance in a line. Your flame teams hit the firing ports, suppress anyone inside. While they're dealing with fire, my boys get charges against the doors. We blow them, then you hose the interior through the breaches. Coordinated, simultaneous, no second chances. It was a solid plan that addressed the bunker's strengths while exploiting the flamethrowers' unique capabilities. But it required precise timing and no small amount of luck. If the smoke dissipated too quickly, they would be caught in the open. If the charges failed to breach the doors, the defenders would have time to recover from the flame attacks. And if the Japanese had positioned forces in the surrounding area to ambush anyone attacking the command post, the entire team could be wiped out in seconds. Chen weighed the risks against the alternatives and made the call. They would execute Delgado's plan. Mortars laid smoke along a 100-yard front, creating a chemical fog that turned the battlefield into a gray twilight. Under its cover, the assault team moved forward in a skirmish line, keeping low, weapons ready. Kovacs could hear movement to his left and right but could see almost nothing beyond 10 feet. The smoke burned his throat and made his eyes water, but it also provided concealment from the bunker's defenders, and that was worth temporary discomfort. They emerged from the smoke perhaps 30 yards from the bunker, close enough that Kovacs could see details clearly. The concrete was scarred from the previous day's bombardment but intact. The firing ports were dark slits that revealed nothing of what waited inside. For a moment, everything was silent except for the distant sounds of fighting elsewhere on the island. Then a machine gun opened fire from the leftmost port, tracers cutting through the dissipating smoke, and the assault became chaos. Marines scattered, seeking whatever cover existed in terrain that offered almost none. The machine gun swept methodically across the killing ground, and men fell screaming or silent depending on where the rounds struck. Kovacs hit the dirt behind a low rise that provided perhaps 6 inches of protection, enough to keep him below the gun's direct line of fire but not enough to feel safe. Walsh was somewhere to his right, invisible in the smoke. Delgado and his demolition team had gone to ground as well, their carefully planned approach disrupted before they had advanced halfway to their objective. Lieutenant Chen, operating on instinct and training, made a split-second decision that would later be analyzed in tactical reviews and taught at command schools. Rather than trying to reorganize the disrupted assault, he ordered the flame teams to fire from their current positions. The range was extreme, pushing the M2 to its absolute limits, but the alternative was allowing the machine gun to continue slaughtering his men until no one was left to press the attack. Kovacs heard the order through the chaos and acted without conscious thought. He rose to one knee, shouldered the wand, aimed at the firing port spitting tracers, and triggered the weapon. The stream of burning gel that erupted from the M2's nozzle stretched across the distance in a perfect arc, covering ground that should have been impossible for a man-portable flame projector. For a moment that seemed frozen in time, Kovacs watched the fire travel, a ribbon of liquid sun that maintained cohesion despite the range, despite the slight breeze, despite every factor that should have dispersed it into harmless droplets. The flame entered the firing port with surgical precision. The machine gun fire stopped instantly, replaced by sounds that emerged from the bunker's interior like voices from another world. The jellied fuel, designed to stick to whatever it touched, had splashed inside the confined space and immediately ignited everything combustible. Within seconds, smoke began pouring from every opening in the structure, not the gray smoke of the mortar rounds but black, oily clouds that spoke of materials never meant to burn being consumed anyway. Walsh fired an instant later, his stream targeting a different firing port on the bunker's opposite side. His shot covered even greater distance, nearly 140 feet according to later measurements, and achieved similar results. More smoke, more sounds of catastrophe contained within concrete walls that had been designed to protect but now served only to trap. The bunker that moments earlier had been a fortress became a crematorium, and the defenders who had felt safe behind 3 feet of reinforced concrete learned that their protection had become their tomb. But the bunker complex was larger than it had appeared from a distance. As the main structure burned, a secondary position 50 yards to its left opened fire, a machine gun that had waited in silence now engaging the Marines who had been focused on the primary target. And this time, the gunners had learned from observing the flame attacks. They did not target the assault force generally. They aimed specifically at the men carrying flamethrowers, recognizing that eliminating those weapons would restore their defensive advantage. Walsh took 3 rounds in rapid succession, 2 through the torso, 1 through the neck. He collapsed without a sound, the flamethrower's tanks spilling fuel across the coral sand but not igniting, the weapon's safety mechanisms functioning even in the catastrophic failure of the operator's body. Kovacs saw him fall, saw the blood spreading in an expanding pool, and felt something inside himself shift. The fear that had been a constant companion since landing on BDO transformed into something colder and more focused. The machine gun that had killed Walsh was still firing, still killing, and Kovacs carried the weapon that could silence it. He stood fully upright, ignoring the rounds snapping past, and advanced toward the second bunker. The distance was too great for effective fire, perhaps 170 feet, beyond even the M2's theoretical maximum range. But Kovacs had seen what the weapon could do, had watched flames reach across distances that should have been impossible, and some instinct told him that if he aimed high enough, let the gel arc through its trajectory, he could reach the target. He squeezed the trigger and held it, letting the weapon empty what remained in its tanks in one sustained burst that lasted nearly 5 seconds. The stream of fire that emerged was the longest anyone had witnessed from a man-portable flamethrower in combat. It arced high, reaching perhaps 30 feet at its apex, then descended in a perfect parabola that ended at the bunker's firing slit. The jellied fuel, still burning despite traveling through air that should have cooled and dispersed it, poured into the opening like water down a drain. The effect inside the bunker was apocalyptic. The machine gun fell silent. Smoke erupted from hidden ventilation ports. And then, perhaps 15 seconds after the initial hit, a muffled explosion shook the structure as stored ammunition cooked off in the extreme heat. The bunker's roof lifted slightly, settled back into place with a grinding sound of concrete separating, and the entire structure began collapsing in on itself, internal supports weakened beyond their capacity to bear weight. Delgado and his demolition team used the moment of shock to rush forward and place charges against the main bunker's entrance. The explosion that followed blew the reinforced door inward, creating a breach through which Marines poured fire from rifles, submachine guns, and one final burst from another flamethrower operator who had moved up during the assault. Within minutes, the entire complex was silent except for the crackling of fires that would burn for hours. But the cost had been severe. Walsh was dead. 3 other Marines had been killed in the initial machine gun burst. 5 more were wounded seriously enough to require immediate evacuation. And this was just one bunker complex among dozens scattered across BDO. The mathematics of attrition were brutal and simple. At this rate of casualties, the Marines would run out of men before the Japanese ran out of fortifications. Lieutenant Shin recognized the problem and adapted tactics yet again. Rather than assaulting every bunker, he began bypassing positions that did not directly threaten the advance, leaving them for follow-on forces to reduce. The priority became reaching the airfield, cutting the defensive network, creating conditions for a breakthrough. Speed mattered more than thoroughness. And that meant taking risks, accepting casualties, pushing forward even when prudence suggested consolidation. Throughout the afternoon, Kovacs moved from fight to fight, his flamethrower becoming an extension of his will. He had mastered the weapon's quirks, learned how wind affected the stream's trajectory, understood how to adjust his aim based on range and target type. He no longer needed spotters to identify bunkers. He could read terrain, spot the subtle signs that revealed hidden fortifications, and engage them before they could fully deploy their defenses. By late afternoon, he had personally silenced 14 bunkers, a number that would have seemed impossible 24 hours earlier but now felt like simple mathematics. Each bunker required roughly the same sequence. Approach under covering fire. Achieve firing position. Aim for openings or ventilation ports. Trigger the weapon. Watch the smoke rise. Move to the next target. The repetition created a kind of emotional distance, a protective numbness that allowed him to function without dwelling on what each attack meant in human terms. But that numbness came at a cost. Other Marines had begun looking at him differently, with an expression that mixed respect with something approaching fear. He had become efficient at killing in ways that disturbed even combat-hardened veterans. The flamethrower was not like a rifle that killed at a distance, allowing the shooter to maintain psychological separation from the act. This was intimate violence, and Kovacs's willingness to employ it repeatedly, without apparent hesitation, marked him as someone who had crossed thresholds most men never approached. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Chen's platoon finally reached the airfield's perimeter. The runway stretched before them, coral-surfaced, marked by bomb craters from the preliminary bombardment but still largely intact. Around its edges, Japanese defensive positions formed a dense network, each bunker positioned to cover the approaches, each gun emplacement sited to create interlocking fields of fire that would make any assault across the open ground suicidal. Intelligence estimated at least 30 major fortifications defended the airfield, with unknown numbers of smaller positions and hidden reserves. Reducing them all would take days using conventional tactics, and with Marine casualties already exceeding 3,000 across all units on BDO, Command could not afford protracted siege warfare. They needed the airfield operational within 48 hours to support follow-on operations elsewhere in the Pacific. That timeline allowed no margin for methodical clearing operations. It demanded aggressive tactics that accepted high casualties in exchange for speed. The plan developed by regimental headquarters called for a coordinated assault by multiple battalions, converging on the airfield from different directions, overwhelming the defenders through simultaneous pressure that prevented mutual support between bunkers. Flamethrower teams would be distributed across the attacking units, each team responsible for clearing specific bunkers identified through aerial reconnaissance and combat observation. It was ambitious bordering on reckless, requiring precise timing and coordination among units that had been fighting for nearly 2 days without rest, whose communication systems had been degraded by casualties and equipment loss, whose morale was sustained only by forward momentum and the knowledge that stopping meant dying. As darkness fell on the second day, Kovacs sat with his flamethrower and considered the weapon that had kept him alive through battles that should have killed him. The tanks were empty now, the last of the fuel expended on that final bunker. He would need to return to the beach to refuel and rearm, a trek that would take him back through territory already bought with blood, past aid stations filled with wounded, past rows of bodies awaiting burial details that might not come for days. The thought of that walk, of seeing again the cost of the ground they had gained, filled him with a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. But before he could move, Chen appeared with orders that changed everything. "Division wants a demonstration," the lieutenant said, his voice flat with fatigue. "They've brought forward combat cameramen. They want footage of the flamethrowers in action for training films and morale purposes. You're to refuel, then participate in an assault on bunkers near the airfield's northern edge. Tomorrow morning, first light." Kovacs wanted to refuse, wanted to say he had done enough, burned enough, killed enough. But refusing orders was not an option, and part of him understood the logic. If footage of the M2's effectiveness could be distributed to other units, if more Marines could be trained to employ the weapon properly, perhaps future assaults would cost fewer lives. Perhaps the men dying on other islands would have better tools, better tactics, better chances. So he nodded acceptance and began the long walk back toward the beach where supply dumps held the fuel that would let him bring fire to more bunkers, more defenders, more men who would die screaming inside concrete boxes that had promised safety but delivered only death. The night passed in a blur of mechanical actions. Refuel the tanks. Check the ignition system. Test the nozzle. Receive new assignments. Study maps by flashlight, identifying targets, planning approach routes, calculating fields of fire. Around him, other Marines prepared for the morning's assault in similar fashion, each man locked into his own small sphere of necessary tasks, avoiding thoughts about what dawn would bring. When morning arrived, Kovacs found himself part of a carefully staged operation. The cameramen had set up positions that offered clear views of the target bunkers while remaining protected from direct fire. Infantry would provide covering fire and security. And the flamethrower teams, including Kovacs and 2 other operators, would demonstrate the weapon's capabilities against fortifications that represented the strongest the Japanese had constructed on BDO. The target selected for the demonstration was a massive bunker that had been designated Bunker Complex 17 during planning sessions. It consisted of a central structure surrounded by 4 smaller satellite positions, all connected by trenches and mutually supporting. Intelligence estimated at least 40 defenders occupied the complex, with stockpiles of ammunition and supplies sufficient to hold out for weeks if not reduced. This was not merely a defensive position. It was a fortress, and its capture would require tactics that previous wars had never imagined. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.